So I was either blessed or cursed to get promoted at a very young age in my department. In fact, I was the youngest person to get promoted at every rank. And when I got promoted to sergeant, I was absolutely convinced that I was prepared to be the best sergeant my department had ever seen. You know, coming off of a transition from kind of the old autocratic, salty sergeants we had to this kind of new age of leadership. I had just gotten my criminal justice management degree. I was very well read on contemporary leadership issues. I was in love with my profession, in love with my city, in love with my police department. So I thought, I'm really ready to be prepared to be the best sergeant in my department. Until the first day in roll call that I stood in front of my troops and I looked into the faces of the men and women that I was now expected to lead. I was expected to get them off their cynicism, get them to work together well, get them to be productive and get them to be creative, and all these great things that leaders are supposed to do for their people. And on that day, looking into their faces, I realized I don't know how to do that. Because the job had taught me how to be a police officer, as it does all of us. It doesn't teach us to be leaders. So on that day, I realized what I didn't know how to do, and I decided to go back to school. Went back to school to get a master's in business administration. And in graduate school, one of the classes that I took, I can't even remember which class it was, but the first moments of the class, of course, the students are introducing themselves. And in every class, because of electives, we all had different students in every session. But in this particular session, there was an individual who introduced himself as a neuroscientist from Northern Illinois University. Now, we weren't getting our MBAs there at Northern, but here he was, this Northern University professor with multiple PhDs, multiple master's degrees, a neuroscientist, and he's there getting a business degree. And I found that very, very intriguing. He was also one of those people that immediately when you looked at him, you knew he was smarter than the rest of us. He was actually a little bit socially awkward, you know, what I might refer to as a little bit nerdy. But here he is getting his MBA with the rest of us. And so at the very first break of class, I feel a tap on my shoulder. I'm talking to someone, tap on my shoulder, I turn around, and it's the neuroscientist. And the neuroscientist says to me, "Excuse me, did I hear you correctly in your introduction? You are a police officer." And I said, "Yes." And he kind of looked at me with an awkward look on his face, threw his hands up in frustration, kind of, and turned and walked away. Well, I was young, I was in my 20s, you know, and I thought he just disrespected me in policing. So I was kind of ready to fight. So I go after him a little bit aggressively, and I get him by the arm and I said, "Excuse me, what was that about? Do you not like police officers?" And he was very timid, and he said, no, I have absolute admiration for police officers. I'm absolutely amazed at what you have chosen to do with your life. But can I ask you another question? And I said, "Sure." And he said, "How long do you intend to be a police officer?" And I said, "It's my career, 20, 25, 30, 35 years. This is where I'll likely spend my adult life." And again, he looked at me with that kind of awkward expression, threw his hands up again, turned around and walked away. And I go after him again. And I said, "Okay, what is this about?" He taught me two terms, which are the foundational reason we teach Blue Courage. And he said to me, "We as neuroscientists know that human beings live in one of two worlds. The first world that human beings live in is what we call an impoverished environment." And he said, "So you understand what an impoverished environment is. It's an environment that a prisoner of war, while they're in captivity, that's the environment they're in, impoverished. An impoverished environment is an environment that is devoid of all of the necessary nutrients that are absolutely essential to sustain life, health, and well-being." And he said, "Let me tell you what happens to a human being in an impoverished environment." He said, "The brain literally begins to shrink in size. It gets smaller. The neurons, the dendrites, which are the connections, the neural pathways that allow for good cognition and allow the different parts of the brain to talk to each other, become disconnected. What we have spent a lifetime learning is lost, and our ability to learn new things is hindered." And while I was curious about that, and I found that interesting, I couldn't quite understand what that had to do with us. And then he said this: "Policing has every classic characteristic of an impoverished environment." He said, "That's why I reacted to you the way I did when you said you'd been on the job as long as you have been, and that you intend to be here for your adult life. Because if you are in an impoverished environment, and likely you are, what is happening inside of you is what we as neuroscientists call slow death. It's what Joseph Wambaugh, the famed LAPD detective and author, described as the slow drip of corrosion that eats away at a police officer's soul. He said, policing has every descriptor that we look for in an impoverished environment. And you are the only profession we have ever studied that has all of them. The closest to you only has 50%. And on that day, I remember him saying to me, if you love your family, you love your life, you want to have a long, fruitful, flourishing life, what he told me on that day is get out. Get out. Unless you can find a way to change the conditions that you are working in. So he then taught me the second environment human beings live in, which he described as an enriched environment. He said, imagine that prisoner of war who is released from captivity. They feel the sunlight on their face. They're released into the loving arms of their family. They are getting proper sleep and nutrition and all the things that we need to sustain life and to flourish. And he said, interestingly enough, the process of the brain in an enriched environment begins to reverse itself. The brain begins to grow to its normal size. The neurons, the dendrites reconnect. What you've spent a lifetime learning that was lost is rediscovered, and your ability to learn new things is enhanced. Now, this was way back in the 1970s that he was teaching me this, in the end of 1970s, early 80s. Today, there are household words that describe this process, but those words didn't exist back then. But the neuroscientists understood what happens to us as a consequence of chronic stress. Today, we call this process brain rebirth, neurogenesis, neuroplasticity of the brain. Because of MRIs and imaging, we know so much more about how the brain functions, what keeps it healthy, and what causes it to be impoverished. So I have literally spent the majority of my professional life attempting to figure out how do we transform our too often impoverished environments in our police agencies into enriched environments where we don't expect our police officers to merely survive them, but we are creating environments that will unleash talent, that will amplify human capacity, and that will really release the great capacity that our police officers bring to this job but too often lose.